Hi, this is Katie Green.
Hi, and this is Dan Green, and welcome back to the Greening Out podcast. And we're doing episode 3 of our interview series tonight, and we have Dr. Sean Gabb with us. Dr. Gabb is he's an author and he is the director of the Libertarian Alliance UK. Thanks very much for coming on the show, Sean.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.
So, Sean, hi, I'm Katie. I'm Dan's wife. It's just I hadn't actually spoke to you myself yet, so I thought I'd say hello.
Well, hello, Katie. Good to hear
Hello.
from you.
And what I'd like to do, like Dan said, just jump right in. And in your opinion, Sean, why do you think so few people in Britain identify as being libertarian?
A number of reasons. One is that I regret to say that libertarians are often born, not made. I think it is almost as much a predisposition with which you're born as your sexuality and maybe even the colour of your eyes. And so there may not be that many of us. The other, I suppose another answer is that we have not been very good at reaching out to those of us who are out there. And something I've been thinking about quite a lot over the past few years is that the mainstream British libertarian movement, for as long as I've been a member of it, which means going back 35 years, have made a serious strategic mistake. And that mistake may have made sense in the late 1970s. It was to identify ourselves with the Conservative Party. Now, if you are not as old as I am, you may think, what a bizarre strategic choice to make. But in the late 1970s, it seemed to me, for example, young as I was, that the Conservative Party was the most openly available vehicle for the propagation of libertarian ideas. We were wrong. And what I think has happened is that nowadays, if you tell most people, I'm a libertarian, and the moment you start explaining what you believe, they say, oh, I see, so you support rich people, don't you? And we may say, no, we support the right of people to get rich, but ultimately what we support is the right of all individuals to life, liberty and property. And that applies just as much to poor people as to rich people. Indeed, poor people have a greater need of these rights than rich people. The problem is that the way in which we have often interpreted, or the way in which we have allowed others to interpret our meaning of that phrase, life, liberty and property, is that it means tax cuts and lower regulations for the rich and cuts in subsidies for the poor at the bottom. Whereas I think a better long-term strategy would have been to emphasize the need for tax cuts and lower regulations for the poor and the abolition of subsidies for the rich, because it is the poor who are the most hurt by heavy taxation, and certainly who are badly hurt by the comprehensive regulation of lifestyle and economic activity that we have in this country. And it is the rich who benefit not only disproportionately, but overwhelmingly from government spending.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, sir.
No, you carry on. I've said my bit.
No, sorry, I was just going to say, I completely agree. Why... Katie, she said, why do people not identify as libertarians? Because in my experience, a lot of people act like libertarians in their own life, but they don't have a name for it. Like, they don't understand the word libertarian, and they want to be left alone. They want to not bother people. They want to get on with their lives, but they don't seem to understand that this is it's a philosophy. If you say, are you a libertarian? They're kind of like, what's a libertarian? But they act like that every day of their lives.
Yeah. Well, yes, but it doesn't help when some of us, and that includes me in an earlier incarnation, keep acting and speaking as if libertarianism meant Tesco minus the state. It means a great deal more than that. Indeed, it may mean something very different from that.
Well, yeah, as well, like, when you say like Tesco minus the state, and I've heard you kind of speak before about how, well, I totally agree, like how some people think that because we say we're libertarian, we identify like we solely support big corporations. But what these
Mm.
people, particularly people on the left, fail, well, I know those terms are kind of meaningless, but what we call the left, the kind of socialistic people, what they fail to understand is without a state, there wouldn't be these big monopolies, there wouldn't be Tesco and Asda and all this kind of thing, because those can only exist with a state. Without, obviously them being in the pockets of politicians, there could be no such thing as those massive, corporations that we have.
Yes, indeed, I entirely agree with you. The problem is that I think something that we can agree on is that there is very little prospect in the foreseeable future of a total abolition of the state. And the strategies we are looking at are strategies of diminishing the size and power of the state. And what is very important is an agenda. What is our agenda? What are the first things we will cut? And far too often we allow ourselves to say, oh, well, we would abolish the top rate of income tax. We would remove these regulations, those regulations. Oh, and we would, we'd abolish tax credits, and we'd abolish unemployment benefit, and we'd abolish the National Health Service, and all the rest of it. People should stand on their own 2 feet. The problem is that that agenda is probably unjust in itself, and it's certainly bad politics. It allows us to be portrayed as defenders of the rich.
Yeah, and that's the thing, and it's so completely untrue because, I mean, what I've been struggling with, and what a lot of us struggle with, especially in Scotland, because people are so left wing up here,
Mm.
it's yeah, you probably know. The problem is like they think that the NHS is great and stuff, and like anyone that's against these kind of the massive public institutions must be against the poor, which
Mm.
is it's just a nonsense because people, if we really opened the market and got rid of things like the BMA and things like that, if we really opened the market to healthcare, people could get healthcare completely tailored to them. And all things like these government programs do, like say the NHS or welfare or anything, for me it infantilizes people because it
Yes.
makes them think, well, there's no consequences. I can just have a child, I don't need to worry about saving for the child or anything. I can just have a child if I want to, it's fine. And the government will all pay for it. But it's not the government, it's us that pay for it. And that's kind of what gets me.
Yes, indeed. Any discussion of the NHS, though, again comes back to the question of the agenda. What is to be done, and in what order are things to be done? And as far as I'm concerned, the first steps towards ending the NHS are to abolish the medical monopolies. It is ridiculous that you need to go to a doctor before you can get medical treatment. You need to go to a qualified doctor when quite often unlicensed practitioners are just as good. You need to abolish the medical monopoly of prescribing drugs so that we can go to a pharmacist again, just as we could in the past, and ask for the medicines that we think we need. And we also need to cut back, perhaps not abolish, but to cut back on the patent system for drugs and other medications. I'm not suggesting at the moment that we should completely abolish the concept of intellectual property in our laws. That is a controversial issue among libertarians and probably among anarchists as well. But we should certainly reduce the level of intellectual property protection to what it was in the 1950s and 60s. Now, once you've done that, you bring down the cost of medical treatment considerably, at which point it becomes a valid argument to tell people that they should start to look after their own health and not rely on the state. Unfortunately, too many libertarians and free market activists always look at NHS reform as a matter of cutting the existing range of medical treatments for ordinary people while leaving licensing and patents and the prescribing monopoly all in place, at least for the foreseeable future. And of course, if you are an ordinary working person, a phrase I don't need to define, I think, if you are an ordinary working person, yes, the National Health Service, we all know, is not perfect. But you see, if you break your leg, if you get a cancer, if you have a heart attack, it's there for you, and it will do a decent enough job. You might not get the treatment at the time you want it. You may not be entirely satisfied with it, but it will patch you up and keep you going. And you have an uphill struggle in telling those people, stand on your own 2 feet. You don't need the NHS. Because unfortunately, most people do need it. And we need to live with that fact. And rather than take it away from them, we need to wean them off it gently by allowing other and better alternatives.
Oh yeah, no, I would agree. Actually, I wrote an article and it was a while ago, and it was kind of just a sort of stab in the dark. What do you think? And it was an idea of like, what if we decided to make the NHS voluntary, and it was just like, so you could pay into it sort of through your taxes, and make it a voluntary institution. And I was just exploring the sort of question of, how many people would choose to pay into it, and could that be a way of phasing it out? Like, for example, you make it voluntary at first, and then you eventually, I mean, I've not completely thought it through, but it was just sort of throwing it out there to see what people would think, originally make it a voluntary institution and see what happens.
Yeah, it's an option. It's part of, it can be incorporated into the agenda. But as I said, you'll get nowhere by simply proposing a cut in the level of existing care without also allowing voluntary alternatives to emerge.
Well, it's interesting you say that. Funnily enough, Dan and I were looking the other day. I thought we were looking actually for pet insurance for our dog. And one of the things I came across was, and I'm also looking into getting a pension, and I thought, hey, I'm going to have a look at private healthcare in the UK. I'd never really thought to look at it before. And it was really interesting because I went on to one of these comparison sites, I can't remember which one, and it was interesting because I put in all of our details, I'm a smoker and such things, and the prices were pretty low, and I thought this looks actually kind of doable. And then I noticed in small print at the bottom of the page it stated that these services were to be used as not as an alternative to the NHS that we have here, but as a supplement. And I thought that was a bit unfair. I thought, oh, I don't really have a choice here, do I?
Well, I'm afraid that does make sense. I had a friend some years ago who died, most unfortunately, of multiple sclerosis. And the private health treatment is very good for acute conditions. If you have a heart attack, or if a lump is discovered on your kidney, or a brain tumor, or something like that, you will get immediate, high-quality healthcare.
Yeah.
But you may need to spend the next 5 years on rather expensive drugs. You may have recurring problems. And it is very difficult for an insurance company to work out the premiums to cover you for that level of care. A very good American friend of mine had 3 heart attacks in his late 40s, I think it was. And again, his private health insurance sorted out the acute care very easily, but the chronic care, they had to take another mortgage on the house. He's had to spend the last 20 years working like a slave to pay off all the debts incurred, and to keep up the payments for the drugs. So private health insurance, as things are currently set up, cannot easily cover you for chronic healthcare. It can cover you for acute healthcare, but not for chronic. And before we can expect the private insurance market to take on that level of risk, we need to bring down the costs. And that does come back to abolishing the medical licensing laws and to cutting down on the range of intellectual property protections for patents. Another point I would come to, though, a number of points. The first is that I haven't had a dog for many years, but the cost, her vet bills towards the end, when she had all manner of things wrong with her, were always very reasonable. The consultations were about £20 a go, and the drugs were about the same per month. Another thing I would say is that during the past 30 years, we're continually told that the costs of healthcare have a great deal of inflation built into them. The cost is always going up. Healthcare is more and more expensive. But I really fail to see the reason for that. Increasingly, we have the application of computer technology to medicine, and that should be bringing costs down. At the moment, my mother had her gallbladder removed a few years ago. 10, 20 years ago, that would have meant a 6-inch incision in her side and someone pushing his hands in to get at the inflamed organ. Whereas a couple of years ago, it was a 2-inch incision and a camera and a laser gun was pushed in. The gallbladder was pulled out with forceps and she was stitched up and moving around within a couple of days. It's possible for a surgeon in Geneva to carry out an operation, still at the moment a very basic operation, but to carry out some kind of surgery in Los Angeles without having to get on an aeroplane, simply by doing it online. It's also possible for someone with my degree of handshake to perform brain surgery, because you now have computer-assisted surgery which evens out handshake. And all of these things and many others should have been bringing down the cost of healthcare in just the same way as it's brought down the cost of printing books and the cost of virtually everything else. And the reason why healthcare prices keep going up and up and up is that somewhere along the chain someone is skimming off. And I don't have the degree of knowledge of the healthcare market to tell you where the skimming off is taking place, but I think it's reasonable to assume that there is some degree of unnatural inflation in healthcare costs. They should be coming down, not going up.
Oh yeah, I would absolutely agree with you. Funny enough, you mentioned then your American friend, and like I said about the BMA, Professor Walter Block, who I'm sure you're familiar with. Yeah, he mentioned that the problem with the American healthcare services, the AMA, obviously the American Medical Association, he argues that get rid of the AMA and healthcare prices will go down. Obviously, get the state out of it. Obviously you've got this craziness there with the Obamacare and all that, which is just like forcing people by law to buy a private product, which is crazy. It's insanity. But Sean, what I'd like to do is like to change gears a little bit, and I'd like to ask about, because we find a lot with libertarians that we talk to and things like that, there's a whole massive debate about voting and things like that. And I know that I've read a lot of your work and I've heard you speak and stuff, and I know that you've talked about you do vote, and that you've said that I ideally vote UKIP a lot of the time. And this has been another question that we found within libertarian circles about UKIP, because I'd like to ask you, do you think that UKIP is like just a step in the right direction, or do you think that UKIP could be something bigger than that? It could be something that takes us to a much better place?
Oh, well, the short answer to that question is I don't know. I vote UKIP for a number of reasons. I have become somewhat less intemperate in my Euroscepticism over the past few years. I'll leave that there unless you want to pick up on it later on. I don't like the Conservative Party, though I'll confess that I am a natural conservative. I am, in the cultural sense, a Tory. but I don't like the Conservative Party because it isn't conservative.
You mean Tory in the old sense?
Yeah, Tory in the old sense. You know, to be honest, I like the old order in England. I'm not saying it was perfect, but I like the old order of Crown, Commons and Lords. And I'm even willing, so long as it doesn't burn people at the stake, I'm even willing to put up with the established Church of England or the established, isn't it the established Presbyterian Church in Scotland? I'm not sure what.
I'm not sure. I wouldn't know. Sorry.
No. But you see, that order's gone, and the present Conservative Party has no idea of how to bring it back and doesn't want to bring it back and doesn't know what the old order was. The present Conservative Party is a joke. I'm frightened of the Labour Party. Many libertarians in our country just don't bother voting. And that is a valid choice to make. I feel uncomfortable about not voting. I feel even less comfortable since 2001, when the turnout fell sharply and the victorious Labour Party said, oh, the turnout fell because people are so happy with the current order of things. Well, no, I think not voting, so far as it can be interpreted as broad satisfaction, it is a bad idea for libertarians. And so the question is then, for whom do you vote? You can vote for any number of the microscopic libertarian parties we have in this country. If one is standing in your constituency, or you could perhaps stand as an independent libertarian and collect 35 votes.
No, what I was going to say, I find it kind of funny how UKIP are so demonised in the press because they want to have a debate about immigration. Because immigration, like mass immigration, obviously, not just like certain people coming to better themselves and work in a country. I mean, mass immigration is a big deal. And as soon as you start the debate, you're labelled as a racist. However, like the Green Party, who have some MSPs in Scotland, I know they've got one MP in England. They're not demonized in the press, but their policies, if you read them, are much, much more dangerous economically than anything UKIP is saying, but they're not demonized at all.
Well, yes, because Greens are by definition good people, and UKIP is, so far as it is a British nationalist party, notice I said British nationalist, not British national. So far as UKIP is a British nationalist party, it's filled with bad people, closet racists, homophobes, and Little Englanders. Now, the fact that there may well be some truth in those claims doesn't help matters, does it? If you want to ask about immigration, that is, of course, a very difficult question. Do you want to discuss it?
I wouldn't mind, like I do have some opinions on it, like I said, I don't have a problem with people coming to this country. I mean, Katie came here from Canada as a child with her parents, and my grandparents came to Scotland from Ireland, so I don't have a problem with people that want to come here and work and make a better life for themselves. However, I am very skeptical about these mass immigration policies. Especially, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but especially the SNPs, and we will get into this in a little bit, but I want to get into that in a different way, but they have an idea for bringing a lot of immigrants into Scotland, and this is the problem, because I think that this mass immigration, this EU open borders thing, it's going to create, and I think they know this, I mean, it's obviously going to create some real social tensions, and it already has, but it's going to get worse. And I mean, I don't know if you remember a few years ago, Nicolas Sarkozy, David Cameron, and Angela Merkel all came out pretty much at the same time saying multiculturalism had failed, but then nothing happened about it.
Well, no, nothing would happen. Okay, look, if we lived in, what should I call it, an anarchist society, a natural order, a stateless society, I think let's stick with stateless society.
That's what I like to use, yeah.
Yeah, if we lived in a stateless society, there wouldn't be borders to have open or to close, and people would move to territories. But the people who moved to an already occupied territory would need to have skills that were desired by the existing inhabitants, and there would also be considerable social pressure on those people to integrate into, or at least not openly to challenge, established ways of doing things. And so let's suppose, for the sake of example, that you belong to a religion which requires women to dress up like black pillar boxes, and you move to a country like England or Scotland, where that kind of behaviour is regarded as somewhat iffy by most of the inhabitants. Well, in that case, you might find trouble finding work, you might find trouble finding somewhere to live, you might find trouble finding people to deal with you on an everyday basis, and you would need to consider whether to change those particular customs or to return to a part of the world where those customs hold undisputed sway. However, what we have had is not the kind of movement you would get in a state-less society. It has been subsidized mass immigration of very poor and unskilled people, indeed people with nothing to offer, from profoundly alien cultures. And that is in itself trouble. And when I say it's subsidized, what I mean is that there is a generous and open-ended welfare system for those who understand how to exploit it, and there is also coerced association with the natives on terms which are generally unfavourable to the natives. That's what I mean by subsidized mass immigration. And when you have that, you have trouble. And when you also allow residents in a particular territory to be virtually synonymous with membership of the local political nation when it brings voting rights, well, you do have trouble. And I think when mass immigration started in the 50s, and it didn't really start until the 60s, let's face it, it was promoted for a number of reasons. One of the reasons why it happened was that industrialists in places like Lancashire and possibly southern Scotland had a choice. Economic change throughout the world meant that they could no longer shift large amounts of textile goods at prices that gave them a profit. And so they had to go up market, they had to innovate, they had to find new products and new ways of creating and marketing those products, or they could cut their labour costs by bringing in dirt cheap immigrants. And there was quite a bit of that. More recently, now that what you could call cultural Marxists are in the ascendant, I think a lot of mass immigration, pardon me while I clear my throat, pardon me, I think a lot of mass immigration has, for the past 20 years, been driven by a desire to balkanize the population. If you can turn a reasonably homogeneous population with a high degree of political accountability into a set of mutually uncomprehending and often hostile groups who do not look to each other for support against the state, but are inclined to look to the state for support against each other, then you can undo the past 300 years of increasing progress towards accountability of the ruling class to ordinary people. And even without Andrew Neither's admission in the Evening Standard a few years ago that Labour opened the floodgates to rub the noses of the right in diversity, even without taking that conspiratorial view, I think that is what has happened.
Well, it has seemed to me a little bit like a divide and rule tactic, a little bit, because a lot of these things seem to, even when it just seems like they do divide and rule all the time. Even when you get onto things like gay marriage and all these kind of things, it seems like the power elite just love to play divide and rule with the British people, like any chance they get.
Yes, I read your article on gay marriage, and I thought it was a very good one. What you said was that this is a dividing tactic. What it does is it sets cultural liberals against cultural conservatives, And instead of arguing as a single group against our overly empowered ruling class, we've been ripping at each other for a couple of years over whether, whether these disgusting sodomites should be allowed to devalue the word marriage, or whether it's just one of those things that people do, and what's wrong with it. I'm glad that gay marriage was forced through as quickly and as ruthlessly as it was, because the issue appears for the moment to have died. The gay marriage advocates have won, and so we can stop arguing about it.
But they just create more, don't they? There's just so many things. I mean, this independence thing we have going on here has created so much divide in Scotland.
And actually, if we're going there, I'd actually like to. I read something you wrote called "A Brief Argument for English Independence."
Oh yes.
Yeah, and I've been very, very skeptical about the Scottish independence, the whole thing. And the reason why I've been skeptical is because they've been branding it as independence. But for me, independence means independence. So you couldn't be a part of the EU. You couldn't have the pound, central banking, the Bank of England, and retaining the monarchy. Now, I noticed that you said that you think that Scotland should completely sever from England and have no currency union, no shared institutions, whatever. And I would actually agree with you, on those terms, because I think what they're billing as independence is just a complete red herring, because they're keeping all the same power structures intact.
The article I wrote on Scottish independence, or English independence, a few years ago was deliberately written to generate heat rather than light. And so although I made a number of points that I would stand by, I would probably withdraw from the overall tone of the article. What I would say is that I wish Scottish independence had not become a political issue. We speak the same language, we inhabit the same island, we have enjoyed generally harmonious relations for a very long time. There is far more to unite us than divide us as a people. Indeed, the amount of intermarriage between the English and Scottish over the past 300 years has been so astonishing that in any kind of genetic view of things, we are the same people. That being said, there are many people in Scotland who no longer regard themselves as British, but as Scottish, and there are growing numbers of people in England who regard themselves as English rather than British. And when you have this cultural moving apart of peoples, it is probably for the best to bring about a political break on reasonably harmonious terms than to wait for things to turn thoroughly sour. If even 25% of the Scottish people are committed to Scottish independence, you can be sure that the other 75% are not deeply committed to the Union, but just vaguely in favour of not changing things. And in these matters, it's the 25% of people who count. And so I don't go to Scotland very often. I have no perception of the Scottish mind at the moment. But if there is a strongly held faith in the value of Scottish independence by a considerable number of people, and it doesn't need to be anything like the majority, I think the argument is over, and it's simply a question of getting on to the next step, which is how do we bring about a reasonably harmonious dissolution of the Union? Those are my views on it.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, my main problem was just because they want to just keep all the original power structures and all this kind of nonsense. And my main problem is, I wouldn't mind an actual free Scotland if we were talking about really minimizing the government and trying to bring about some kind of dissolution of government, but obviously that's not even it's not even on the table. The problem is because I'm really into this and I've written a lot of articles about it, and my main problem is with this fact that most people in Scotland are too left wing. I mean, I know like left and right don't make so much sense, but they're very socialistic, and a lot of people in Scotland are dependent on the state. And every yes campaign that I see is constantly, it's like they don't understand when Einstein said, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing more than once and expecting a different result. So what these people seem to think, especially the radical independence campaign, who are very left wing but have got no solutions, all they want to do is they go, well, the Westminster government's been the problem and our welfare's suffering and our NHS is suffering, so we want more government and then that'll fix the problem. And that just seems like insanity to me, because if government's the problem, then you can't say, well, let's have much more government and that'll fix the problem. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, let me put this to you. We know that every political act has unintended consequences. And let's look at it this way. The two-party system that we have, the 2.5-party system we have at the moment,
yeah, that's the way to put
it, is kept in being by the Union. The reason I will vote Conservative probably at the next election, I usually vote Conservative in general elections, not because I like the Conservatives. As I said, I hate them. I normally vote for the people I hate to avoid being ruled by the people I fear, i.e. Labour. And there are many people in Scotland who hate Labour, but believe that they have to turn out and vote Labour at general elections in very large numbers, otherwise they're going to get another Conservative government in Westminster. Now, if you break up the Union, and I can only speak with any authority on England, but if you break up the Union, it means that people like me no longer need to vote Conservative, because Labour is very unlikely to win a majority of the English seats. And so I can vote UKIP in a general election, and later on there may well be much more libertarian parties with some chance of getting representation in Westminster, because the Conservative monopoly of the non-socialist vote will have been broken. And it may be the same in Scotland. If there is no chance of an English Conservative government to mess up their lives as they see it, they may not feel so obliged to turn out and vote for the Labour Party. They may vote for something else. And you may be surprised by what else people vote for.
Well, yeah, that is interesting, because like it's funny because people in Scotland, and I mentioned this in another article, they've got very, very short memories, because it's only ever since Thatcher and the poll tax, and that was the biggest mistake with the poll tax, was introducing it here first, because then there was a perception in Scotland that we were being singled out and stuff, because before Thatcher and that and all that kind of debacle, there was a lot of Tory MPs that were elected in Scotland. I mean, just now, it's funny, it's still the kind of, electoral zone we're in now was held Tory for quite a while, way back, and then it became Labour, and then when the Labour Party became New Labour and started disintegrating, which they have in Scotland, and being more pessimistic, what we noticed was when the SNP started being more, they were being more optimistic about Scotland, and they were putting out an optimistic message, and all the Labour Party were doing was just being pessimistic about Scotland, and then the SNP just ran roughshod and took completely over. And that's kind of what's led to this major SNP hold on the Scottish Parliament lately.
Well, of course, once independence has been achieved, there is no particular need to keep voting for a party which has as its flagship policy Scottish independence. To some extent, the Scottish National Party will have made itself redundant. I do fear that if Scotland becomes independent, Alex Salmond and his friends will try to impose some kind of semi-totalitarian grip on Scotland, but I don't know to what extent they will succeed. The thing is that Scotland is a nation of 5 million people. Although it has somewhat declined from its 19th century zenith, these are 5 million rather well-educated, mostly hardworking, enterprising people. And I find it very difficult to believe that an independent Scotland would turn into another Yugoslavia. There probably will be considerable economic difficulties before some degree of stability is achieved. But I don't think Scottish independence would be a disaster for the Scottish people. It may bring about certain collateral benefits so far as the Labour Party and the SNP will become redundant. But I don't know. As I said, although I sometimes rave on about the Scotch occupation government that was New Labour and how the Scottish have been destroying our matchless constitution and we should get rid of those disgusting Celtic scoundrels at the earliest opportunity.
Those filthy jocks.
Yes, indeed. You know, as I said earlier, we have a long and generally friendly and successful shared history. The amount of intermarriage between us has blown apart any view that we are separate peoples in the genetic sense. And I wish the whole debate would go away and we could remain a united kingdom with a great deal more personal freedom than we've enjoyed during the past 100 years. But if there is a sizable and committed minority in Scotland which believes in independence, I think all we can do is bow to that and work out the best and most friendly severance package we can so that we can join together afterwards in renewed friendship. Now, I speak on this matter with some experience because 25 years ago I worked in Czechoslovakia as an economic and political advisor to the Slovak Prime Minister. And all of these arguments about Slovak independence kept coming up during my time there. And many people said, Slovak independence is ridiculous because the opinion polls say that only 18% of the electorate are really committed to Slovak independence. My answer to that argument was, yes, but the other 78% are pretty indifferent to the federal state. It's the 18% who will count. And I was right about that. Other people said the Slovaks can't go it alone, that they'll become some kind of fascist totalitarian tyranny. And I looked around and I thought, that's not very likely. And again, I was right. And what you will find, what I found was that when I went to Prague before the separation and I spoke Slovak, the Czechs would give me funny looks. And my wife, who is Slovak, she would get a few adverse comments from taxi drivers. Nowadays, when I go to Prague and speak Slovak, they're delighted. Czech and Slovak, by the way, are very similar languages, and if you speak one, you can be understood in the other one very easily.
Yeah.
And no one comments on my wife's being a Slovak. And indeed, the Czechs and Slovaks get on much better 20-odd years after independence than they did in the years before independence. And so it may well be that a yes vote next month in Scotland will be the beginning of much better relations between the English and Scottish peoples than we've known during the past 30, 40 years. We don't know yet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I said, my problem is from reading all the literature that we're being pounded with just now. It's really like tartan socialism, and that's what I worry about. My taxes are going to go through the roof. But it's funny you mentioned the SNP. You mentioned them. Like my brother, my brother's a bit of a Marxist, right? I don't think he'll mind me saying that. He doesn't mind me saying that, but he's involved with the radical independence campaign and this kind of thing, and he thinks when his analysis that the SNP will, if independence was achieved, the SNP will basically implode because there's so much tension. I mean, I was involved with the SNP when I was a teenager, and they were radically anti-monarchy. Really, a lot of them were anti-EU as well. And
Mm.
then they were very anti-NATO, and they just marginally at that conference agreed to stay in NATO. So there's all these internal differences, but they're all in my view, they're all uniting together right now purely for this referendum. But then if they
Mm.
achieve that, then they're gubbed because then all these internal differences are going to start to come out and they'll start to play out. And that's where I think they'll start to implode themselves. I think he's absolutely right.
Oh, I think so. And I do have a lot of time for classical Marxists, assuming that is what your brother is.
Yes, yes.
Yes, rather than a neo-Marxist.
Absolutely.
I'd rather be stuck in a lift with a classical Marxist than a politically correct greeny new Labourite.
Oh, I agree. Yeah.
Classical Marxists want much the same as we do. They want a better deal for for ordinary working people. They have a respect for scientific knowledge. They believe in scientific progress, and they also believe in the norms of rational debate. Whereas if you go up against these politically correct people, they don't argue. They smear. They accuse. They take shelter in absurdities. They also don't believe in economic progress. The problem with the classical Marxists is that they have a false theory of economics, a false theory of history, and to some extent a false theory of human nature. But once you put aside those differences, we can get along very well.
I think you're absolutely right. And Sean, as we start to wrap up here, and this has been really great so far, what do you think, just in a final question, what do you think it would really take in the UK for, for libertarianism to come to the forefront? I know a lot of people, I don't think we would see it in our lifetime. We spoke to Keith Preston, I know you know Keith Preston.
Oh yes, I know Keith very well.
Yeah, we spoke to him, and he was saying that, like for example, I said, what would it take for a state to secede and stuff in America, and he said it would need to be a complete economic breakdown, Soviet Union style. So, do you think that's what it would take in Britain for us to actually have real liberty and real freedom? Would it have to take a real breakdown from within?
I suspect one of my few disagreements with Keith, then again, it may not be a disagreement because he's talking about North America and we're talking about the island of Great Britain. I think a total breakdown in this country would lead to a totalitarian hellhole.
That's what I'm worried about Scottish independence. So yeah.
I think what we need is a renewed burst of economic growth. You've noticed, the Jimmy Savile mania, the pedo hunting. Oh, yeah. Is that a mania north of the border as well as south?
Oh, absolutely. It's over all the papers. Yeah.
Yeah.
News, yeah.
Okay. One of the reasons why people seem to be wandering around city centres chanting, hunt the pedos, kill the pedos, etc., is because they are frightened. Something has gone badly wrong. You can't get a job in this country very easily. If you do get a job, it's a crap thing with 0 hours and minimum wage. You're not looking forward to a pension. You can't buy property very easily. Everything has turned to crap. And when that happens, people are drawn to various lunatic ideologies. One of the reasons why the 16th century in Europe was a time of total religious mania, heretic hunting, witch hunting, you name it, is because there was right across the whole of Western Europe, Scotland, England, France, Germany, Holland, etc., there was a collapse in living standards for ordinary people. The 15th century was quite a jolly time where ordinary working people lived well. In fact, ordinary working people's living standards did not recover their 15th century level in this country until the 1880s. There's something called the Felt-Brown-Hopkins Index, which I should send you, which is rather depressing reading. And when people see their living standards collapse in this way, when they're less well off than their parents and grandparents, they will be drawn to various kinds of mania. And although there has not been the same kind of collapse of living standards in this country as happened in the 16th century, it is quite obvious, in my view, that ordinary working people's living standards are lower in most senses that matter. They're lower today than they were 30 years ago. And in a time of declining living standards, it is very difficult to make arguments for toleration and free markets and general laissez-faire. It is very difficult. And so what we need for a return to any kind of libertarianism, any kind of liberalism in this country, is to get past this current decline in living standards. And you could say, well, what we need is libertarianism in order to raise living standards. Well, yes, but there are other things that can be done within the corporatist paradigm. We need to get rid of regulations. We need to get rid of taxes. We need to do something about the way in which energy is supplied to us, these giant oil-based monopolies, the green taxes, and all the rest of it. When ordinary working people know that they're better off today than they were 5 years ago, and considerably better off than their parents, and when they can reasonably look forward to being better off still in 5 years' time, then you will probably not see manias like the Jimmy Savile panic. You won't see the endless screaming headlines in the toilet paper press, and you'll be able to go back to arguing for just leaving other people alone.
Well, we hope so. We certainly hope that at least maybe our hypothetical children could live in a world like that. I would like to think that it could happen one day. So I think that it's a good happy note to leave the show. Maybe there's hope for the future.
But Sean, yeah, please do tell us about your books. I know you've got a new book out called The Break, I believe, and tell us about where people can find you online.
Oh, right. Well, my website is www.seangabb, that's seangabb.co.uk. For the past 8 years, in the past 8 years, I've written 10 novels, 6 of them historical novels brought out by Hodder and Stoughton, and these are very heavily, though obliquely, libertarian. I've also written a number of science fiction novels, and the latest of these is The Break. It is a dystopian post-apocalyptic novel set in and around London in 2018, about a year after some completely inexplicable catastrophe. The mainland United Kingdom is exactly the same, but the rest of the world is back in 1064.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
It means that we are cut off from our trading links. We can't import oil or gas. We can't import food. Our export industries, our service sector, collapses. And the government could have done certain things. It could have brought in some reasonably fair scheme of rationing, as in 1940, some short-term state of emergency stuff. It could have reached out to the peoples of Western Europe and created a co-prosperity sphere. It could have done many things. But what the government has done instead is decided that if people are allowed to run away in their millions from this country, as they certainly would do, then their own particular order of things would collapse. And so they ban all contact with the outside world, and they allow a third of the population to starve to death, and they impose a totalitarian horror on the survivors. And the novel begins 11 months after this break in the normal sequence of time, and is a political thriller which is marketed partly at the young persons, at the younger age groups. But I think it works for the general market as well. It's got some very good reviews, and it's been nominated for the Prometheus Award, which is the main libertarian fiction award in the United States. And I'm hoping that it will do rather well. It's done well in the past 2 months, but it could do still better.
And where can people find that?
You can buy it. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it on Barnes & Noble. You can buy it on iTunes. As long as you type in Sean Gabb The Break in your favourite online bookseller, you will get to it. And it's available in all formats. It's available in hardback, in paperback, for Kindle, for Nook, for Kobo, for iPad, and every other format, so far as I can tell.
I know there's far too many nowadays to keep track of.
There is, but I need to.
Well, thank you so much, Sean. I mean, we could probably talk to you for about 10 hours, the amount of things we'd like to ask you, but thanks so much for sharing your time with us. We very much appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I hope that at some point you can have me again.
We would love to. We've got so much to ask you, but that's great, Sean. We really appreciate this, and obviously for more libertarian podcast ratings and news, please visit greeningoutpodcast.co.uk. I've been Dan.
I've been Katie, and this has been Dr. Sean Gabb, and thank you for listening.